there. Something that's occurred to me during this past COVID year without very much travel is that cemeteries have been a very big feature of my travelling life. This is actually my local, the Camperdown Cemetery in Sydney, and it's a particularly atmospheric spot, especially on a grey, wet, bleak autumn afternoon.
You know you're in for a treat here when you're greeted by this incredible fig and the cute little caretaker's residence. This cemetery opened in 1848 after the cemeteries in the centre of Sydney started to buckle under the weight of a rapidly growing population.
For a time, this was the most important cemetery in Sydney.
About 18,000 one-time residents and aspiring residents are buried here, including some big names in early colonial history. Among the aspiring residents, the victims of Sydney's worst maritime disaster. In August 1858, after months at sea sailing from England, the Dunbar crashed on rocks at Sydney's South Head, killing all but one of its 122 passengers. Just imagine months at sea only to die metres from your destination.
You know, I don't really find wandering around an old graveyard like this morbid at all. They feel like sort of historical ruins, really.
And they're beautiful and atmospheric places too. This is a green space much loved by local residents and local birds.
A few months ago I made a video about St John's Cemetery in Parramatta, which is the oldest European cemetery in Australia, in a pretty dismal state of disrepair. But making that video, and since that time I've also been conscious of the fact that I've been visiting cemeteries around the world since I first stepped on an aeroplane and left Australia more than 3 decades ago. So I thought it might be interesting to sort of go back through the archive. I wasn't shooting video 3 decades ago, and have a look at some of the cemeteries around the world. It's just a small number really, but that I've got sort of images of, and just have a think about why it is that cemeteries are such interesting places to travel to.
Our little cemetery hop will take us to the US, the UK, Europe, and of course Vietnam, and then back here to Australia. My earliest memory of being a graveyard tourist was in New York in the late 80s, when I'd just left Australia for the first time. While making the mandatory tourist pilgrimage to Wall Street, I stumbled across the Trinity Church graveyard, where I saw the oldest grave I'd ever seen. I discovered for the first time that the Dutch East India Company created a little settlement called New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island long before the British arrived and changed the name to New York. It was around the same time in the 17th century when the Dutch East India Company ships were crashing into Australia's west coast on the other side of the world. It was the early years of a few centuries of colonisation that are still having a massive impact on the world. This mediocre print is the only shot I could find from my visit to Trinity Cemetery. Not long after, I crossed the Atlantic and headed to Highgate Cemetery in London to visit the grave of Karl Marx. No matter what you think of the man, he produced some of the most potent ideas of the last 2 centuries. Little did I know that images of Marx and the hammer and sickle would become very familiar in the following decades while living in Vietnam. Cemeteries and memorials were a big deal for me as a foreigner in Vietnam trying to make sense of the history of the country. They were like these old battlegrounds that I've also found moving places to visit. The Vietnamese are actually pretty restrained in their commemoration, especially given the amount of death and misery they've suffered in war. In May 1954, Ho Chi Minh's troops defeated the French here at Dien Bien Phu, bringing an end to French colonial rule. This is the graveyard in the centre of Dien Bien Phu town.
But a lot of those
that holds just some of those who fell in the battle on the Vietnamese side. Chú tên là gì ạ? Tương à? Chú I met this wonderful man, a veteran of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, at the Dien Bien Phu Cemetery. In his mid-teens at the time, he was here when French forces collapsed on the 7th of May 1954. Defeating the French wasn't enough. They were followed by the Americans. The Tungsten Cemetery, north of the old DMZ on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, is the largest military cemetery in Vietnam. The old border area and the Ho Chi Minh Trail are where some of the deadliest fighting took place. This vast cemetery only holds a small number of the millions killed in the Vietnam War. Often the smaller unknown monuments have the biggest impact. This temple remembers 8 young women who were killed in a US aerial bombardment that left them trapped in a cave in November 1972. Crews worked through the bombing to open the cave and rescue them, but failed. It wasn't until the 1990s that the cave could be opened and their remains recovered. On the other side of the DMZ lies Vietnam's former imperial capital, Hue, where the tombs of the Nguyen dynasty emperors are at the centre of the travel experience. 2 of my favourites don't get many visitors though. One dates from this man and the beginning of the Nguyen dynasty in 1802, and the other from its demise, and this woman, the last Queen Mother. Zalong was the emperor, the first man to unite what we now know as Vietnam, the sort of contemporary map or something close to it, as a united state. And Hue was the capital, and Zalong lies at rest up here. He probably lies in one of the most under-visited tourism sites, most deserted tourism sites in the whole country and in the region. So this huge figure in Vietnamese history lies out here in the middle of the jungle. The abandoned feel at Zalong's tomb just adds to its beauty. There are usually pretty interesting reasons why some tombs and cemeteries get lots of official attention and money, while others are left neglected.
So this is exciting, entering the tomb of Vietnam's first Nguyễn Dynasty emperor. Anh tên là gì anh? Anh tên là gì?
Nhật.
Nhật à? Hướng dẫn của tôi là bảo vệ và hướng dẫn luôn. Cả hai. Người tốt.
The guard, a lovely bloke, opens up and shows me around.
Listen to the sound of this place. Incredible sound. Incredible acoustics. So here's Gia Long and his wife.
Whatever their intentions, it's a pretty unpretentious end to proceedings for the first emperor and his wife. Though not as unpretentious as the tomb of the last member of the royal dynasty to die in Vietnam, Madame Tu Cung. So just headed out on a little mission to find Tu Cung's tomb. Tu Cung was the mother of Vietnam's last king, Bao Dai. And this is where she is buried. She died in 1980 and she stayed in Hue throughout the Vietnam War and throughout the handover when her son Bao Dai left for France. I think he left in the late 50s or the mid 50s. She stayed, and she stayed throughout the war, and of course Hue was very much at the centre of the conflict as well. So she was a kind of brave lady by all accounts. She also stayed when people of privilege like her were leaving at the end of the war in 1975. And this is where she's buried. It's a long overdue visit. A few hours drive south in Da Nang, another important Vietnam historical moment is recorded in this obscure cemetery on a hill. What we have here is a little cemetery that was created in 1898 to commemorate the French and Spanish forces that tried unsuccessfully to capture Da Nang in 1858, so 40 years earlier. I'm guessing it's the only place in Vietnam where foreign soldiers who were trying to invade, trying to colonize Vietnam, it's the only place where they lie buried still on Vietnamese soil and where their tombs are still visible. This is a popular place for wedding photography.
It's more a lot of photographies.
All kind of photography, huh?
Kind of photographies.
Okay, I'll go through. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm wandering around the old colonial cemetery in the middle of Penang, and here you'll find the graves of the original British settlers that colonised this area in the late 18th century and lived here through the early 19th century. And one of the first things you notice is the number of graves here that carry small children. There are so many very small graves here, and most of them have children under 1 year of age in them. Given the way the colonial powers treated local people, whether you're in Vietnam or here in Penang, there's something very odd about wandering through these old colonial cemeteries.
Even more odd when they have a new use as wedding photography locations.
This place reminds me of another very memorable colonial era cemetery, the one in Calcutta, in the centre of Calcutta.
For so many reasons, Calcutta in India is one of the most extraordinary places on earth. It's very high on my list for post-COVID travels. I took these shots 15 years ago, so I'm curious to know what Calcutta looks like now. This is the British colonial South Park Street Cemetery that dates back to the early 1700s. It's right in the centre of Calcutta, and it gives you a sense of the scale of the British East India Company's reach all the way back in the 18th century. This graveyard is right by St John's Church, not far from the legendary Black Hole of Calcutta. The Black Hole incident of 1756 was the prelude to the Battle of Plassey in 1757 that saw the British East India Company strengthen its grip on the country. Calcutta became the centre of the British East India Company's Indian operations.
All the graveyards and tombs in this selection are connected in some way with colonisation, dispossession and conflict.
In 2014, on the 100th anniversary of the beginning of World War I headed to Belgium and France to explore the battlefields and the graveyards of that horrendous war. Like many Australians before me, I was also interested to explore Australia's role in the war. 60,000 Australians died out of a total of about 20 million deaths. I'd known the first number for many years, but I'd never really asked about the second number. They are appalling numbers. And they're even worse when you consider that World War II followed 20 years later. World War I is a big part of Australian national mythology. Australian governments spend up big on these monuments and keeping these graveyards impeccably manicured. Meanwhile, back in Sydney, the oldest European cemetery in Australia, located in Parramatta, looks starved of funds and is pretty dismally neglected. I don't know if it's a Parramatta problem or what it is, but this cemetery is home to more than 50 First Fleeters and a whole lot of prominent early settlers as well.
It's kind of hard to believe that this is the oldest surviving European grave in Australia. Thanks for joining me for this little look at some of the cemeteries I've been fascinated with over the last, 20, 30 years or so. And I guess if you're still watching, it means you probably share my fascination. And we will talk again very soon. Thank you.